The moment you finally spoke up, the entire room shifted. Not because you were loud, not because you demanded attention, but because fear no longer had a place inside you, and from that second onward, nothing could remain the same. There comes a precise, unavoidable moment in every chosen one's journey when silence stops serving as wisdom and begins to rot into self-betrayal. And until that moment arrives, quiet is often misunderstood. For a long time, you stayed silent, not out of weakness, but out of discernment. You were watching behaviors, tracking patterns, studying intentions, and quietly measuring who was capable of handling truth and who relied on illusion to survive. Most people never recognized that your silence was deliberate. They mistook your patience for passivity, your restraint for submission, and your self-control for fear. They assumed you would always absorb disrespect, tolerate distortion, and shoulder emotional burdens that were never yours to carry. But something inside you reached its limit, not in anger, not in desperation, but in clarity. When you finally spoke, it wasn't reactive or emotional. It was calm, precise, and grounded. And that is exactly why it struck so deeply. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the standard. You didn't debate. You named reality. And in doing so, you revealed what most people spend their lives avoiding: truth spoken without fear or attachment. That single moment didn't just alter conversations. It rewired power dynamics. Those who were once comfortable around you became cautious. Those who underestimated you fell silent. And those who benefited from your quiet suddenly felt exposed, because your words removed the fog they were hiding behind. This is the paradox of the chosen one. When you finally speak from alignment, you don't need repetition or explanation. Your presence carries the message. Understand this clearly. What changed everything wasn't the words themselves, but the version of you that spoke them. You had already endured isolation, survived being misunderstood, and outgrown the need for validation. So when your voice emerged, it carried weight, not aggression, not resentment, but authority. And once a chosen one speaks from that place, there is no return to who they were before. The version people felt safe dismissing dissolves. From that point on, interactions become honest, or they disappear entirely. Manipulation loses its grip, illusions collapse, and respect, whether offered freely or forced by reality, becomes inevitable. Point 1. Your silence was never weakness. It was calibration. For a long time, you existed in a state of intentional quiet, not because you lacked thoughts, opinions, or inner clarity, but because you were gathering information with precision and restraint. You were watching how people behaved when they believed they had the upper hand, observing who only listened when it benefited them, who spoke over others to assert control, and who quietly rewrote narratives to protect their own position. This season of silence is often misunderstood, even by the chosen one themselves. From the outside, it can look like hesitation, weakness, or passivity. From the inside, it is something far more deliberate. It is calibration. You were learning the emotional temperature of the room, mapping invisible power structures, and identifying who respected boundaries versus who depended on your compliance. Silence gave you clarity without exposure. It allowed you to see without being seen, to understand without being challenged, and to grow without interference. While others rushed to speak, eager to prove themselves or dominate conversations, you chose patience. You understood that premature words reveal more about the speaker than the situation. So you waited. You watched patterns repeat. You noticed inconsistencies. You recognized alliances, insecurities, and unspoken rules. In that quiet, your awareness sharpened and your confidence deepened, not outwardly, but internally. You were not shrinking, you were consolidating power. Silence became your shield and your classroom. But there comes a moment when silence no longer serves growth, when it begins to enable distortion or injustice. That is when the weight of remaining quiet becomes heavier than the risk of speaking. When you finally opened your mouth, it was not emotional, reactive, or uncertain. It was precise, grounded, final. Your words carried authority because they were informed, measured, and undeniable. The shift did not happen when you spoke. It happened long before, in the quiet moments where you chose understanding over impulse. And once that threshold was crossed, there was no returning to the old dynamic. The room changed because you had already mastered it. Point 2. When you spoke, you didn't defend yourself. You defined reality. When the moment arrived, your words were not fueled by emotion, and that absence of emotional charge is precisely what made them impossible to dismiss. They were not rushed, fragmented, or defensive, and that restraint gave them gravity. You did not attempt to convince anyone, because conviction does not require persuasion. You did not argue details, because arguments invite negotiation, and you were not negotiating your reality. You did not justify your position, because justification places your truth on trial. Instead, you stated what was true, plainly and without ornament, and truth delivered calmly has a destabilizing effect on environments built on assumption, avoidance, and manipulation. Most people are conditioned to expect noise. They expect emotional reactions, long explanations, raised voices, or circular back and forth exchanges that allow them to redirect, dilute, or escape accountability. What they are not prepared for is clarity without attachment. When you spoke, you were not trying to win approval or dominate the room. You were establishing reality, and reality does not argue. That is why some people froze, not because you were aggressive, but because there was nothing to push against. That is why others changed their tone immediately, softening their posture or becoming unusually quiet, as if recalibrating their position in real time. You removed ambiguity, and ambiguity is where control usually hides. It is in vagueness that manipulation survives, in unspoken assumptions that power quietly operates. By naming what was happening without anger, without accusation, and without emotional leakage, you collapse the illusion that kept certain dynamics in place. The unspoken rules no longer applied because you had spoken the truth out loud. This is why your words lingered long after the conversation ended. They replayed in minds because they were not reactive statements tied to a moment. They were observations tied to reality. You did not attack anyone's character, so there was nothing to defend against. You did not raise your voice, so there was no emotional spike to blame. You did not threaten, so there was no immediate conflict to resolve. You clarified, and clarity forces a reckoning. People either adjust themselves to it or quietly avoid it, but they cannot pretend it was never said. This is the quiet power of grounded speech. It shifts the axis of the room without drama, without spectacle, and without apology. In that moment, you did not escalate the situation. You ended the illusion, sustaining it. And once an illusion is named, it cannot be restored. Point 3. The shift you felt was a power reversal. After you spoke, something subtle but unmistakable occurred, and it unfolded not as noise or spectacle, but as a quiet internal shift that rippled outward into every interaction you touched. The room did not change, but the atmosphere did. People adjusted without realizing why. Eyes lingered longer. Pauses entered conversations where certainty once lived. This was not imagination, nor was it coincidence. It was recalibration at a social and psychological level. The kind that happens when an unspoken hierarchy is gently but firmly rewritten. Power, in its truest form, rarely announces itself. It does not need to raise its voice or demand attention. It adjusts the field. Before this moment, others may have felt entitled to project onto you, to interrupt your rhythm, to assume compliance, and to believe you would bend, explain, or absorb whatever was placed in front of you. That assumption was never spoken aloud, yet it governed how they treated you. When you finally spoke, clearly and without apology, that assumption collapsed. Not because your words were aggressive, but because they were anchored. You spoke from alignment. And alignment is disruptive to those who rely on imbalance to feel secure. Grounded individuals are difficult to manipulate because they are no longer negotiating their worth in real time. They are not scanning faces for approval or adjusting their tone to maintain comfort. This creates a form of unpredictability that the human nervous system immediately recognizes. People become more careful. Their language tightens. Their jokes soften. Their boundaries suddenly appear where none existed before. This is not fear. It is respect born from uncertainty. They can no longer read you as someone who will absorb excess, tolerate subtle disrespect, or silently carry the emotional weight of the room. In this moment, many chosen ones experience a realization that rearranges their understanding of authority. True authority does not come from dominance, volume, or intimidation. It emerges from self-alignment, from the moment your inner posture becomes immovable. The shift you felt was not about controlling others or winning in exchange. It was about reclaiming authorship over yourself. And when that happens, every external dynamic responds accordingly. People treat you differently because you are no longer available for the roles they unconsciously assigned you. You are no longer reactive. You are rooted. That alone alters gravity. Conversations are slow. Assumptions dissolve. Energy redistributes. Nothing dramatic needs to happen after that. The change has already occurred, and it continues quietly, steadily, reshaping how the world meets you without ever needing to explain itself. Point 4. Some people became distant. That was the confirmation. One of the most telling outcomes after you finally spoke your truth was the sudden distance that emerged from certain individuals. And at first, this distance can feel disorienting, especially if you were conditioned to believe that harmony always requires closeness and constant access. But what you experienced was not rejection, and it was not punishment. It was confirmation. Those who pulled away were not responding to your tone, your delivery, or even the specific words you used. They were responding to the loss of unrestricted access to you. Your previous silence created space for projection, assumption, and quiet advantage, allowing others to define you in the ways that benefited them, while avoiding accountability. When you spoke, that dynamic collapsed. Your voice introduced boundaries, clarity, and consequence. And in doing so, it removed the comfort of ambiguity that certain people relied on to remain close without truly respecting you. Faced with that shift, some chose not to adjust, not to grow, but to retreat, because adapting would have required self-reflection, humility, and a new way of relating to you. This is not something to grieve or second-guess. It is something to clearly recognize. Alignment always produces separation. The moment your inner truth matched your outward expression, relationships built on imbalance could no longer survive proximity. What felt like sudden loss was actually the exposure of fragility that had always been there, hidden only by your restraint. Growth often feels lonely in its early stages because the environment must reorganize itself around a more authentic version of you, and reorganization is rarely quiet or comfortable. Old dynamics dissolve before new ones form, and in that in-between space, silence can feel heavy. But this solitude is not emptiness, it is recalibration. You did not break connection, you revealed its limits. You did not create distance, you stopped collapsing yourself to maintain false closeness. The calm that follows is not absence. It is integrity settling into place. Over time, what remains around you will be fewer but truer, quieter but stronger, built not on access, but on respect. And when you look back, you will see that the moment you spoke was not the moment you lost people. It was the moment you stopped losing yourself. Point 5. You didn't become louder. You became unavoidable. A common misconception is that speaking up means speaking more, filling space with noise, opinions, explanations, and constant self-assertion. That was never your path, and on some level, you always knew it. When the moment came that changed everything, you did not suddenly become louder, more expressive, or eager to be heard in every room. You did not begin correcting everyone or defending yourself at every turn. In fact, something almost paradoxical happened. You may have spoken even less than before. But the energy behind your silence shifted, and people felt it immediately, even if they couldn't explain why. Your presence changed. The way you occupied space changed. The way people oriented themselves around you changed. Your words became rare, and rarity creates value in a world saturated with constant talking. When you speak only when necessary, your voice stops competing for attention and starts commanding it naturally. People listen differently. They lean in without realizing they are doing so. They sense that what you are about to say is intentional, measured, and grounded in something deeper than impulse or emotion. This is the quiet authority of the chosen one. Not someone who dominates conversations, but someone whose silence carries meaning and whose words carry consequence. You didn't need to announce your boundaries. They became visible through your restraint. You didn't need to prove your intelligence. It revealed itself through precision. You didn't need to demand respect. Respect adjusted itself around you. Others began to notice that when you spoke, things settled. Confusion cleared. Decisions sharpened. Your voice was no longer background noise. It became a signal. People understood instinctively that you were not speaking to be liked, validated, or acknowledged, but because something needed to be said. That is what makes your presence unsettling to some and grounding to others. You are no longer reactive, and reaction is what keeps most people trapped in endless explanation. You moved into a position where silence does the heavy lifting, and words simply finalize what has already been understood. That is why your voice is unavoidable now, not because it is loud, but because it carries weight, and weight cannot be ignored. Point 6. Speaking up sealed the end of the old version of you. There is a moment in every chosen one's life that cannot be undone. A moment where silence finally feels heavier than truth, and speaking up from a place of grounded clarity becomes inevitable. Once that line is crossed, something within you shifts permanently, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that cannot be reversed. You can no longer pretend not to see what you see, because awareness has rooted itself too deeply. You can no longer unfeel the subtle distortions in energy, the small disrespect hidden behind politeness, and the emotional imbalances masked as normalcy. Where you once tolerated these things for the sake of harmony, your nervous system now rejects them as misalignment. This is why your peace deepens, yet your tolerance narrows. It is not that you have become harsher or less compassionate. It is that you have become more honest with yourself. You are no longer willing to trade self-respect for temporary comfort, no longer willing to shrink your truth to preserve fragile dynamics. The old version of you, the one who absorbed tension quietly, who carried emotional weight without complaint, who adjusted endlessly to keep things smooth, was not weak. That version was adaptive, intuitive, and necessary for a certain season of your development. It learned patience, empathy, and restraint. But that version has completed its role. Growth does not destroy who you were. It integrates the wisdom while releasing the self-abandonment. You no longer confuse endurance with virtue or silence with strength. What emerges instead is a self that is quieter, clearer, and far less negotiable. Your words are fewer, but they carry weight. Your boundaries are calmer, but they are firm. You do not argue to be understood, nor do you explain yourself to be accepted. You simply stand where you stand, rooted in internal alignment. This is the stage where many people misunderstand you because they are still interacting with the version of you that no longer exists. But you are not here to be convenient or easily digestible. You are here to be congruent. And once congruence is established, there is no returning to the discomfort of living out of alignment. What you lose in tolerance, you gain in peace. What you release in accommodation, you reclaim in sovereignty. This is not a phase. It is a settled state of being. Point 7. This wasn't rebellion. It was alignment. It is essential to understand what this moment truly represented, because misunderstanding it diminishes its power. You did not speak up to rebel against authority, nor to posture, dominate, or announce superiority. You did not do it to be admired, validated, or remembered. You spoke because silence had become a betrayal of your own core, and continuing to swallow your truth would have fractured your integrity beyond repair. Integrity is not loud, dramatic, or performative. It is the quiet agreement between who you are internally and how you move externally. Alignment occurs when that agreement is restored, when your inner truth and outer expression finally match without negotiation or self-betrayal. And when alignment locks into place, life does not remain neutral. It reorganizes. Reality responds. Some relationships stabilize because they were built on truth and mutual respect, while others dissolve because they were sustained only by your silence, compliance, or emotional self-erasure. Opportunities shift not as a reward, but as a natural recalibration. Paths that required you to stay small quietly close, while paths that require authenticity begin to open. Boundaries no longer need speeches, explanations, or emotional labor, because they enforce themselves automatically. People either adjust or drift away without confrontation. This is not chaos unfolding around you. It is order returning after a long period of internal misalignment. From this point forward, you will notice something subtle yet unmistakable. The urge to over-explain, justify, or announce who you are begins to dissolve. You no longer need to declare your values, your strength, or your standards. Your presence carries them. Your tone, timing, and stillness communicate more than arguments ever could. This is the quiet outcome of alignment, an authority that does not seek permission and does not require applause. Conversations change. Dynamics shift, People sense that you are no longer available for manipulation, guilt, or silent compromise, even if they cannot articulate why. And this is the most important truth of all. You did not change everything by speaking up in that moment. Everything changed because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. If this resonates, it's because you didn't speak too soon. You spoke exactly when you were ready.